Let's consider a case closer to home. If we want to measure something like economic growth or GDP, well, obviously we should do it per capita. And I think previously we looked at the GDP in Canada was a nominal GDP. 2014 was around $2 trillion, Canadian money. And of course, the population was around 35 million, more or less, and that led to GDP per capita, nominal GDP of about $60,000 per person. And then keep in mind what GDP represents. It's the final goods and services produced in a country in a given period of time. So this is the total product. And of course, it includes things like government purchases and even foreigners that purchase things. So it's our ability to produce things. But I want to compare the two places, Quebec and Alberta, for example. In the case of Alberta, the GDP per capita, now we're losing the same currencies, Canadian money, Canadian dollars. It's about $91,000 per capita. In Quebec, it's about $45,000. So that means to say that using this method of calculation, ability to produce things, Albertans produce about twice as much as Quebecers do. Now, you might ask, why is that? Well, there's a variety of reasons. They have natural resources, they have oil, but then Quebec has electricity, hydroelectricity. It could be also the population, the people working are differently, they're managed differently. There's a whole variety. Prince Edward Island, wonderful place to live, by the way. Standard of living in that sense is quite high. It's only $41,000. But obviously, the GDP in Quebec is higher than Alberta. So one of the important things to consider in comparisons is to make sure that the comparison is per capita, per person. If we want to make comparisons between different countries, comparing GDP, well, then we run into a problem that, for example, in Canada, we measured in Canadian dollars, but in Switzerland, it's measured in Swiss francs, or in the United States, US dollars. And how can we compare Swiss francs with Canadian dollars? One of the problems is that we can use the current foreign exchange rate, but that can lead to strange results. For example, I recall once being in Switzerland and talking to a bus driver in Switzerland. He told me what he paid for his rent and what he paid for coffee was expensive. Everything in Switzerland was expensive. But then the bus driver also told me that once I converted to Canadian money, he was earning like $150,000 a year. So I quickly realized that it wasn't because everything was expensive in Switzerland. It was the exchange rate that was leading to this particular problem. So in economics, what we do is we use something called purchasing power parity, sometimes referred to as simply PPP. The basic idea here is to look at something like the bus driver's salary in Zurich, bus driver's salary in Montreal, and then kind of look at and see how long does it take to earn enough money for something like, say, a haircut or for a kilogram of chicken. How many minutes, hours? And there's a method of calculating for this. It is referred to as purchasing power parity. So frequently, if you see comparisons between countries, you'll notice this PPP, so that the comparison makes sense, so that they're not using the current foreign exchange rate, which can be problematic. We'll look at this idea of PPP later in the course, but I just want to make this important point about comparisons between countries. And here we've got a quick example. So I just took randomly a few countries. I've got Haiti, Mexico, Norway, and so on. And you'll know, of course, that GDP per capita in the local currency is kind of meaningless. It's just a number, 140,000 pesos. I have no idea what that is in Mexico. But if we compare it, we could use it doing through the market exchange rate, also problematic. But I'm instead going to use this concept of PPP. And here we can see what the end result is. And you'll notice that in the case of Norway, it's about over twice as much what it is in Canada. That means to say it's a bit, this is US dollars. I should have done it for Alberta. I didn't. To compare Norway and Alberta to see what the difference is. Haiti, very small at 800. So this is a measure of the poverty or the level of income. Keep in mind, it's the average. And of course, it has all the weaknesses of GDP in the sense of a country like Haiti. Many people do things informally outside of the market, but clearly they're relatively poor compared to, say, a country like Canada. Usually the typical comparison is GDP per capita using purchasing power parity. You'll notice something. I've done the same thing using purchasing power parity. In this case, 2019 data per capita, and you'll see the list of the top 10 countries or so. What's significant about this list? The highest one happens to be Luxembourg. This is a list I got from the World Bank. You notice that Norway here is indicated as $64,000, whereas before I think it was $100,000. These numbers may vary, But what's significant in this is that all of these countries being listed, Hong Kong, for example, part of China, but is treated as a separate entity. What's significant here is the United States. It's the only large country that is in the top 10. All the other countries, you'll notice, are very small. And it's a very interesting result, a very interesting phenomenon. I have a suspicion that the explanation perhaps for this is the fact that the United States is, in effect, not really one country, at least in an economic sense. It's really 50 small countries, relatively small. California would be the largest, but 30. Population of California, Canada, very similar. Of course, outside of the United States, we tend to view the United States as a single, like the U.S. Congress, the president is very important, and so on. But within the United States, that's not quite how the American economy functions. It functions really as separate, independent states, one from the other. And this may explain why the GDP per capita is so high. I did this little experiment just for the curiosity to see what would happen. Is somebody has made an estimate to the possible is real GDP per capita in using U.S. dollars. Here we don't face a problem of currency, but we do face a huge problem in terms of going back in time. Think of the year 1800. There were no cars then, there was no internet, and they used horses and so on. But somebody made an estimate of GDP per capita correcting for inflation, so it's real GDP, for the year 1800, and then did it annually for a 200-year period. These are clear estimates. And here I've given the data. So that means to say in the year 2000, using base year prices of 2011, it was around $46,000 per person. Now, I looked at the annual growth rate. This is possible to do the calculations. It's about 1%. Real GDP per person grew by about 1% per year in the 19th century, and then grew by 2% in the 1900s. So I took the average of the two, rough average of the two, and I said, well, let's say we apply this off into the future, find out what would be the average GDP per person at the year 2100 in the United States, and it turns out to be about $203,000, twice as much what Norway is now, roughly. So that means to say the average American in the year 2100 will be about 3 times richer than the average Norwegian is at present. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, the average family of 3 or 4 people, the year 2100, in the United States, population of 350 million people, will have an income of about $500,000 or $600,000 a year. If you know of some family living in Canada right now that earns about $500,000 or $600,000 per year, that's the lifestyle they'll have. The average American in the future, because it's going to be rich and poor and so on. But then I decided to carry that on for another 100 years into the future, and then you wind up with close to 1 million. So this is evidence, and this is based on 200 years of data, so it's believable. Keep in mind, too, that between 1800 and 1900, there was a U.S. Civil War, and between 1900 and the year 2000, there was a Great Depression. And despite all of this, there was a phenomenal economic growth. What this indicates is that if we do things correctly, the future is a very, very rich place. Of course, if we make mistakes and get it all wrong, particularly get involved in these wars of jealousy and who's richer and who's poor and fairness and so on. Of course, there's environmental problems too we have to confront. But the future is potentially a very, very rich place.
Und ein Mensch